Great to see so many of you tuning in for such an interesting and important topic. My name is Kate Tarrant and I work for the Lower Blackwood Landcare Group. And for those of you that don't know us, we are a not-for-profit independent landcare organisation with an interest in sustainable agriculture and the broader environment and river health in the Lower Blackwood catchment. You can find out more about us and the work we do on our website, lowerblackwood.com.au. Before we kick off, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we all live and work. I acknowledge the Wadandi Bibbulmun people of the Bibbulmun Nation and pay respects to elders past, present and future. Now, just a few words about the webinar, how the webinar will run today. You may have noticed that you can hear us but not speak yourself. That's deliberate so we can keep things moving along at a good pace. You can definitely still ask questions though, so please don't be shy. Just type your question at any time into the chat box and I'll make sure it gets asked either during or at the end of the presentation. Also, if you do run into technical difficulties, please use the status button, which is the hand and the bottom right side of your screen, to let me know, and I'll see if I can fix it from our end. Don't worry though, if you do have to drop out or leave early, we'll be recording the session and I will be emailing that out to everybody. Okay, so to the reason we have all tuned in today. We welcome Master Tree Grower and author Rowan Reid. Rowan is the Managing Director of the Australian Agroforestry Foundation and founder of one of Australia's largest and most successful landcare groups, the Otway Agroforestry Network. More importantly though, Rowan is a farmer and a tree grower in his own right with over 30 years experience on his own family farm in the Otway Ranges of southern Victoria. More than 10,000 visitors have toured his Bambra agroforestry farm, which is set up as a 42-hectare outdoor classroom for farmers, scientists, students and tree lovers, and a living laboratory for his own learning. Today, Rowan is going to share with us his extensive experience and wisdom in working with trees in this webinar, Growing Trees for Conservation and Profit. So please welcome Rowan, and over to you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you to the Blackwood catchment, Lower Blackwood catchment group. And I don't know who's out there, but I suspect there might be a few of our master tree growers. There's been over 300 in Western Australia. Now, technically, I'm working through the NBN satellite and launching photos through that. So I hope to match my voice with the photos as they turn up. By way of introduction, yes, I'm a forester. I like to think of myself as a forest scientist. I studied university. I've been academic at Melbourne University. I was for 20 years and left 10 years ago. And that coincides nicely with the 30-year period that we've been on the farm that was described before. As an academic, I researched and developed ideas in agroforestry. And if we think about forestry, and I know this is very controversial, just this week in Western Australia, the end of native forest logging is being proposed, and forestry in both native forestry and in plantations is a pretty controversial area. And as a young forester, I didn't want to work in either of those areas really, because I didn't really anticipate that my enthusiasm and my interest in the science would actually have much influence in these areas which were dominated by public opinion and votes, just as we've seen this week. If you don't like what you see in forestry, whether it's native forestry or big industrial plantations, and I'm sympathetic with the view that it may be perceived as being ugly for many landholders, not because they don't see it a justified position, but more it's not something that they'd like to do on their own property. And the way I like to view that, this is a photo of the botanical gardens in Melbourne. And if I allude to my old hippie days, then of the art of motorcycle maintenance, suggests that ugliness that some people see in forestry is not inherent in forestry. And this gardening activity is a form of forestry. So if we let go of our preconceived ideas of what forestry looks like and say, how can we create a type of forestry for which for us is beautiful and this photograph is not my farm. I don't know if Jenny During's in the audience there. This is a Western Australian property, and I use this photo a lot, Jenny, because it is stunning. And for me, it tells a wonderful story about a landholder who's used the interest in science and networking in forestry and her interest in trees and vegetation to create a landscape that reflects her particular interests. So, me, this is really what forestry is about. Now, you could say that's what the companies have done. They've created large-scale monoculture plantations of an exotic pine tree because that reflects their interests. And I say to us as landholders, don't don't be constrained by what you see. Be emboldened by these opportunities. And what I want to do today is share some of those ideas and opportunities. Look at different species, different ways of managing them, with view to giving people the idea that forestry can be much more, and maybe getting them to explore the idea of how it might be created on their property. And I alluded to the master tree grower. We've had about 30 courses in Western Australia, right from the southwest up into the wheat belt, across to Esperance, either many years ago. Went over there, and I've met over 300 farmers in the southwest, and I'm still so enthusiastic about how that they can take ideas of forestry and create something unique in their particular landscape. And as was alluded to, I developed the idea of the master tree grower when it was in Melbourne University, but now it's owned by a not-for-profit group. And like every other group, we try to seek funding to help you deliver programs in your regions in some way. And as I said, in Western Australia, we've had many programs, and this is just another group. I think you can see Richard Moore in the centre and David Jenkins on the left. Some of you may know, and I think these landholders of the area called Serpentine or somewhere near there, one of the areas I've been to. Just another group of landholders who are doing it. And I've also taken the Master Tree Grower program overseas, and this is me standing on a little school chair in a mahogany plantation in East Timor, talking to landholders about managing their trees to meet their requirements and interests. I don't know a lot about the species they grow, but I do, and I am passionate about the opportunities for us to manage our trees and create something new. So the question about what is agroforestry, or what are we actually talking about when we talk about tree growing on farms, my definition is really simple. And I hope my contribution is also very simple, but also constructive, just helping farmers grow trees for the reasons that are important to them. It doesn't matter to me whether you grow a particular species in a particular way on your farm. I'm just interested in seeing whether we can use the science of tree growing and the understanding of the markets and the practices and the skills to help landholders achieve the best outcome for themselves. And that's really exciting. The other thing that's interesting and quite pertinent at the moment is the idea that agroforestry or tree growing on farms is going to be part of what broadly talked about as regenerative agriculture. You could just say tools to enhance the natural capital of our agricultural landscape. And that's critical to me because farmers, us, landholders, control almost 60% of this continent. And most of the productive land in the country, the dark blue area that you're familiar with, is freehold private farmland. And it is in that landscape that I believe the real conservation issue that's confronting our rural landscape. It's not, to me, the issue is not at the forest blockade, and it's not about stopping native forest logging. It's about this landscape, which has been changed so dramatically by agriculture or clearing or development. And it's nobody's fault. It was driven by policy often, but we do know what we've lost. We've lost carbon, we've lost organic matter, we've lost biodiversity, we've lost soil, we've lost water retention, we've lost shelter. And we all know that trees can be play a critical role in bringing some of that back. So whether you call it regenerative farming or just land care or repairing the landscape, the idea that growing trees on farms can be a positive in that respect. So that idea takes me back to the forest. The idea that forestry can be either forestry for profit or, on the other hand, forestry for conservation. Like two paths in the woods, they separate. But what we're looking and exploring about whether we can marry that forestry for profit and forestry for conservation together, cut a new pathway through the undergrowth and create new landscapes in this farming landscape, in the family farming landscape, where we know 100,000 landholders like yourselves have got lots of ideas, lots of concerns, lots of interests, and facing lots of risk for which tree growing in some form is going to be a solution. So that's where I'm coming from, and this is where I am. This is our Bambra Agroforestry farm. This is the patch of land that we purchased in 1987 with a view to, I think back, what was I trying to do 33 years ago, 34 years ago? I think I want to make forestry attractive to family farmers. My family had been involved in farming since the 1850s in Australia. We'd been part of that culture that had cleared and developed the landscape and ignored the potential of trees or forestry to contribute to being part of the family enterprise. So if we're going to make it attractive, the key question was, what would it look like? And to my mind, forestry would have to be something very different. It would have to look different. It would have to deliver different values in some fashion. So the aim of having my own property was to explore what does it look like when family farmers get involved in tree growing and forestry, and acknowledging that it looks different in every way. I don't know if you saw Gardening Australia this last June. I pride myself in cutting down a big tree on a gardening show on national television, and that's a little figment of it. It's really raises that question that I want to confront a much wider audience. I think a lot of farmers would be comfortable that the act of cutting down trees can be an act of conservation, but as you might expect, the wider community see forestry as anti-conservation. And I want to explore some of those ways in which our development of tree growing for profit has actually driven some conservation outcomes. First of all, the trees are planted for conservation, planted along the creek, planted for shelter. The only difference is we're looking at managing the trees that we plant, because we need trees in the farming landscape. We manage them for profit. And I want to explore some of that management in some way. After about 14 years of doing this, and if you're familiar with tree growing, you might see that all those trees on our property were pruned. We had to build the house and the shed, and we planted the trees, and some of those trees have gone, some of them have failed, some of them have worked, and I've developed it over the time as well. But what's exciting about it is we're taking those different aspects of why we want trees. We want them for conservation, for production, for shelter, for agriculture, and also for aesthetics. And we bring those together in some way. And it can be quite complicated. But as family farmers living and working on their own farm, we can change the direction, we can manage these over time and improve those multiple outcomes in some fashion. So the timber that we're talking about, I'm really not talking about growing trees for timber. I'm talking about growing trees for soil and for biodiversity, shade and shelter, and aesthetics, but managing them for timber production so that they're worth harvesting, but also exploring how the act of harvesting them for profit, taking some out for timber, and there's other products as well, but collecting seed and wild foods or other things don't tend to be as destructive. So I often use the timber to confront those paradigm shifts that we're talking about. Can we actually make that commercial? And this is where I think most people who grow trees aren't involved enough. I want to talk about the active management. So even from we're very comfortable about planting trees on our farms and maybe doing some follow-up weed control and taking the guards off 2 or 3 years later. But then most farmers just walk away. They don't do any active management after that. And this to me is the key. So if I can introduce anything, it's the idea that at age 3, 4, 5, 6, just a little bit all the time, you can really do some great things. And the analogy I use is is this little boy rolling this tyre down the hill in East Timor, tapping it with the stick as he goes down the hill. The game that he's playing is not about standing at the top of the hill and just throwing the tyre down and laughing if it goes to the left or one to the right. And the point is, it never goes to the same spot twice. It's exactly the same as if you plant trees. You plant trees, it doesn't necessarily go to some pristine, biodiverse, ideal landscape just because you've let nature take its course. I'm interested in whether or not we, because we live and work in that landscape, can do a little bit of work every year, touching it, just nipping a branch off here, thinning a tree here, correcting its growth in some way. You can take your forest in a much more exciting direction. And that's the activity that we don't see in native forestry, and we don't see much of it in plantations. In plantations, they plant, come back 15 years later, maybe do a thinning. I'm talking about doing a little bit every 1 or 2 years and showing you what can actually happen as a result of that. And I want to explore with some photographs some of those ideas. Now, because I'm in the Blackwood Valley, I want to talk a little bit about Blackwood. It's actually our native acacia, and our native acacia that we planted here on the farm. We're now harvesting trees, and you can see me milling up one here on the little sawmill we've got. This is a 32-year-old tree that we planted, and we're producing some reasonable wood from this. As you can see, if I can get to the end of the video, and there's a slab, and in the next slide you can see the slabs that we got. We managed that tree in a certain way to promote its diameter growth. My slides are jumping around, which is annoying. But we were able to produce high quality timber from a native species, which is recognized as having value in not many years. And that's been quite exciting. But the management is about the pruning and thinning and spacing as the trees grow. Another example might be the messmate. It grows naturally. It's a eucalypt on our property. We've harvested trees that we planted, and we've actually put them through the sawmill. And if I could jump the slides, we've dried the timber in our solar kiln, and that's a piece of mountain ash, but it's a similar species. We're testing the moisture content to get it down to furniture rate. And then we sold that timber to a furniture maker in Melbourne. And I estimate that the tree that stood in the paddock, if I could get someone to buy it, and that's a real question mark, it was probably worth about $200. By cutting down the tree and milling it up myself, probably a day's work to generate a cubic metre of wood, worth selling, I could get about $2,000 worth of wood. And that's what I sold a cubic metre of sawn timber for, dried. They turned it into $20,000 worth of furniture. That could have happened locally. It could happen in Yellingup and sell it to some of the Perth people who come down. You could have these furniture makers taking high quality native timber from your farm and turning it into high value products. But they can't do that if the tree wasn't well managed, if it wasn't worth milling and it wasn't worth harvesting. And that relates to the quality of the tree, which is all about that work we're doing while the tree's actually growing. So by caring for the tree as it was growing, I was able to turn it into something that was worth harvesting down the product. Then the question about, well, everyone's talking about carbon. That little piece of wood on the table there contains as much carbon dioxide as contained in that beach ball. And we know that because the only way wood forms, the carbon from wood must come from the atmosphere. So I've got the mathematics at the side that you can go through. But basically, for every cubic metre of wood, we're taking out about a tonne of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We could leave that growing in the forest, but the advantage of harvesting trees a little bit on a regular basis is that we can keep growing carbon. People talk about planting trees for carbon. Well, it only happens once. And then that carbon is sit there. It's all at risk of rotting or burning or dying. But if we're harvesting trees and putting it in our buildings, we can continue to lock up carbon. So rather than forestry being a carbon sink, it could be a carbon factory. I can produce carbon lock it up constantly for forever off this site by harvesting these trees and letting the retained trees grow more carbon on that site. So in a sense, if we're interested in locking up carbon, active forestry can be a tool of doing that, particularly where we planted trees on cleared agricultural land that didn't have much carbon in the environment. The other opportunity, and where most farmers, if you've got an eroded creek like we had, and you can see the creek on the left, and you can see what I'm doing now, the same crossing. I've planted trees all along that creek, different species, they're different sizes. I'm now harvesting out the eucalypts and creating a rainforest of subtropical timbers, actually. I can see some Silky Oak and casuarinas and Australian Red Cedar, and I can even see a species that I'm going to talk about later that comes from your region that I've planted in amongst these eucalypts as well. And I see that as being a potential product in the future to come. From the eucalypts, we're getting some really interesting timbers. This cabinet was made of 16-year-old timber that we harvested from that creek. You might pick up that it's got a fiddleback grain in it. And that's where the grain of the timber has actually got a wavy characteristic. Now, I'm not sure I can prove why I have so much fiddleback produced by our eucalypts in the creek. I think it's got something to do with my pruning, and that wouldn't be a bad thing because that timber's worth quite a bit. In fact, we've actually harvested trees last year, and you can, don't know whether you can see in that, but that whole tree is fiddleback. It's a blue gum, and it's got fiddleback right through and through, and that timber's been dried now, and I'm keen to see how it comes up. So this is small scale forestry. It's done in a way that doesn't destroy the reason you planted the tree. For example, here's one day's work where I harvested 10 trees. Those trees actually went into a container, went to China, and they came back to Australia as sliced veneer. That veneer is all coming from our trees. It's only 0.6 of a millimeter thick, and it's actually sliced with a knife, so there's very little wastage. And that timber was used in the Australian Tax Office. So all their office walls in 6 stories, it was actually timber harvested from our little land care planting from only 10 trees. The reason I like that story is because forestry can work at small scale. It's got to be different. It can work with chainsaws and tractors rather than huge harvesting equipment and special skills. And it's got to be something we can start exploring. If we can add value to our trees on the farm, we could actually produce some incredible products. I walked into the Bungangore Gallery and saw this table, $5,500, made of shining gum. And I looked at that timber and I said, that timber had to come from my farm, because the growth rings are a long way apart because I grow the tree quickly. But there's no knots in that timber. That means it must have been pruned. And it was veneer. And I rang up the furniture maker, David Emery, and I said, did you get some of that veneer that we'd done for that company in Melbourne? And he said, yeah, I picked out the best pieces and I made that table. It's a veneer wrapped chipboard or something like that. And so sort of an example again, small scale furniture makers can tell a story about timber that's been produced in plantings on family farms. And we're creating a new industry. We're not replacing timber for the building sector. I mean, we're not replacing native forestry entirely, but we are starting to develop a new story. And I know in southwest of West Australia, you've got all these artisan people using jarrah and marri and even some of the local she oaks, and they're producing products, and we could be part of that. Getting back to the creek, when we harvest a tree, I actually leave some of the about half the tree that I don't mill. I leave it in the waterway itself to create these beaver dams. And these beaver dams are crucial for slowing down the flow. I call them beaver dams because we don't have beavers in Australia, but in America, I saw how they're using this, using beavers to actually create and stop flooding downstream by giving them something to harvest. So we use chainsaws, but we create the same result, and that's good for land care. And if you look at what's happened, this is just some research that compared a natural riverbed on the left in Gippsland, and on the right-hand side, the common scenario in an agricultural landscape where they've de-snagged it. They've taken all the trees out, and what you find is that there's no deep pools in that riverbed. It's just often sand, very shallow along the base. But where you have lots of wood in the waterways, whether it's naturally developed over many, many years or whether people have put it in there because of their active management, you get a much better riverbed and much better biodiversity as a result. So that notion that by harvesting trees, I'm creating lots of deadwood. I take some of it away for firewood and for saw logs, but so much of it left there. When I do a thinning, I select the best trees and I thin the trees around it to give my best trees some more space. I end up with a lot of wood on the ground. Now, I call it messy farms, and a lot of people don't like dead wood in the paddocks, obviously, because it's not good for your machinery. But in your conservation areas or in your planted areas, having wood on the ground is a really good positive thing for biodiversity. And by example, we actually found this little creature, an antechinus, in amongst those logs on the ground, and they probably wouldn't be there had we not planted trees. So we can have these habitat elements, and you've got a whole range of species over there that I've been looking at that actually require dead wood and hollows in the ground. The other thing is when you harvest a tree, you have a stump. Now, there's two things that can happen to your stump. Uh, Most commonly, they rot, or they could resprout, but often they rot. And those dead stumps are really important because they get a lot of fungus in it. And other trees that you plant in that vicinity, they can actually enter in and draw moisture and nutrients from that rotting stump. And we've found our trees, our second generation trees, are growing a lot better. What also happens, and this might surprise some people, is that the stump can stay alive even if it doesn't develop coppice on it, even if it doesn't have any leaf. Now, on the right hand side there, that is a stump of eucalypt. It's rotten out in the middle, but it's still growing in diameter, and that's because it's formed a root graft with the tree nearby. And the tree nearby has basically commandeered that root system and uses it for its own benefit now. And again, that has a role in extending the root system of trees and supporting it in some ways. So there's lots of positives that happen with deadwood in the ground and deadwood on the ground. And the best way to get that is grow trees and cut half of them down. Keep cutting some down in some way. Prune some branches off. So here I am climbing up an Australian silky oak, pruning branches off. And yep, you can see it. That's a sugar glider that's landed on our silky oak, and it's chewing into the bark. This is night vision we took a few years ago. And the sugar glider is feeding on the sap that's generated out of that bark. And we've got many sugar gliders. When I fell a tree, they often jump out from under the bark where they're hiding during the day. You can't have sugar gliders if you don't have trees because they need trees. They also need hollows. But if you've got some hollows in some old remnant trees, you don't need a lot, but they need feed trees to get through the winter as well. And you'll have similar native vegetation. But the thing I wanted to raise about silky oak is that it's called oak, and it's called oak because it has a very strong ray cell in it. That's a cell that runs from the center to the outside. And when you cut the wood on a certain pattern, that's silky oak on the left, you get this striking pattern across the surface. It's not fiddleback, although it looks a little bit like a wavy grain. And if you're familiar with oak furniture from Europe, you would have seen this ray cell striking across. So silky oak in Australia is called that. It's a grevillea. But you also know she oaks, and many of the she oaks in Western Australia, the forest oak and various others you've got there, have fantastic wood because they have this strong oak ray in the timber. One of the ones we grow is the New South Wales river she oak. But one I prefer is actually our local native she oak down here, the dripping she oak. And you've got some beautiful she oaks over there. And the Forest and Wood Products Corporation have actually got some information about your she oaks because they recognise it as a fantastic timber. And I've tried to, I think Frasiana, I've tried to plant that out as well because I love the timber. I bought some kitchen utensils made of it in Margaret River when I was over there. These she oaks we know are really good for habitat. Over our way, we have yellow-tailed black cockatoos that have learnt to eat the cones of the Pinus radiata, And there's no shortage of yellow-tailed black cockatoos because they've able to adapt to that exotic tree that's widely planted in the landscape for timber. But there's some other cockatoos in our region, the red-tailed black cockatoo, which only eats she oak and Banksia and one eucalypt nuts, and it's very dependent on those few species. It hasn't learned to adapt, and I think you've got the same situation over there. What would be better than having farmers plant these species because the timber's good, and there'd be thousands and thousands of these trees growing, and there wouldn't be a shortage. It wouldn't matter that some farmers occasionally harvest some of that for timber. There would still be many, many of them. And this is where we start saying, what are the strategies we've got in conserving? Do we make farmers save every she oak and tell them that if they're not allowed to cut a she oak down or a Banksia because it produces such important food resource, farmers won't plant it, or they won't do it unless someone else pays for it, and they'll only do it on a small scale. But if we can get a commercial return for some of these beautiful native timbers that also have habitat value, we'd be planting them all over the place and there'd be no shortage or no. And that's where conservation and forestry policy has to work together and start saying, how can forestry be the solution to our conservation problems, rather than always seeing cutting down trees as the negative. And this species I love. It's your Western Australian river Banksia. It took a little bit while for it to pop up on your screen, I think. It only comes from your area, from Albany to Perth in the southwest. It has a beautiful Banksia flower, but it's one of the largest Banksias. There's two in our region, the Coast Banksia and the Silver Banksia, which are large. This is probably the fastest growing Banksia that we've had, particularly in height growth. And I've seen it developing well on farms down there. And it's an important food source for some of the bird species. But importantly, it produces a gorgeous dark red timber, and this is quite an orange sample in this one, but an orange timber with that patterning that comes from those rails. So I'd really like to see this conservation of the promotion of Banksia in your region as a solution to two problems. The opportunity for farmers to have a productive tree that fits really well into the agricultural landscape, doesn't compete much with pasture, grows pretty tall, grows on a range of sites, including waterlogged clay, which I planted on, which I didn't think Banksias would grow in waterlogged clay. It produces a flower that you can actually sell, and it provides good shelter because it's got dense foliage. It can be managed into a straight tree with a 2 or 3 meter log that can be milled up on any sort of farm equipment, a farm mill, and turned into a very high value product and sold locally through craftsmen or something. To me, this is what everyone involved in rural landscape should be talking about. What are these opportunities? Conservation groups, government departments, employment agencies, and thinking, how can we start driving a new industry, developing new opportunity, providing conservation outcomes with the resource that's right in our backyard, such as our beautiful native species. So this notion that harvesting trees can be part of what drives forestry. There's two photographs here. One's on the right-hand side is my neighbour who grew a pulpwood plantation, very familiar to you guys, blue gum plantation. It's grown for 14 years, cut down, regrown from the stump. That's called rotation forestry. You do the same thing over and over again. I planted trees because I wanted trees. I had no anticipation of ever wanting to go back what it looked like before. So I'm looking at whether we can do a different type of forestry, and you could call it succession forestry, where I'm now cutting it on the left-hand side where that furniture maker made a table out of the trees that cut down from our creek. I'm now taking those eucalypts out. And one of the species that I'm putting back is your species. Now, I tried to take this photo of a river Banksia growing underneath two eucalypts. Now, eucalypts are very sun-loving. I can't grow another eucalypt below a canopy like that. Those large trees are all eucalypts. All their leaves are up 25-30 meters tall. But underneath that, what you can see in that silver leaf is the bottom of the underneath of the leaf of the silver Banksia, which is growing beautifully despite the shade up through the middle of those. So now when I take the eucalypts away, because they've all been pruned up to 6 meters and all you can see is the top of the trees there, I'm actually going to have river Banksia already 12 meters tall, already 20 centimeters in diameter, and then growing on. So I'm never going back to the cleared landscape that it was, and I'm using forestry as a tool to drive succession and get my next crop. You can do that with Australian red cedar. There's our Australian red cedar on the left. You can do it with Silky Oak, Grevillea. You can do it with casuarinas, because these species grow naturally underneath eucalypts and are comfortable in the lower light levels, as long as those eucalypts aren't as crowded as a blue gum plantation. Our eucalypts are planted close together when they're young, but I thin them out so they're about 9 to 11 meters apart, giving good growth for the eucalypts, but plenty of light for that understory. And we're also growing native food, our native pepper, which grows naturally in our area. We also have underneath eucalypts river mints and lemon myrtle from New South Wales, and strawberry gum, which is another eucalypt, but we're just growing it for the leaf. So you can see there that forestry doesn't have to be a rotation. It can be about taking it to the next level, continually improving over a period of time. I mentioned Australian red cedar, and I've seen it grow on Jenny During's property. Sorry, the slides are jumping around. In your area at Bridgetown, it's surprisingly drought tolerant. But the great thing about both you and me is that this is a photograph of how big it is in the Albury Botanical Gardens. They grow large, but what we don't have to contend with is what in New South Wales and Queensland they've got a tip moth that damages the leading shoot of the native Australian red cedar. Now, this is possibly the most valuable timber that was harvested en masse and sent back to England from the colonies of New South Wales and Queensland quite early on. People like to think that it was all logged out, so there's none left. Well, the loggers didn't cut the big ones down. The farmers cut the big ones, all the trees, the regenerating ones. And the farmers cut down the regrowth, but the loggers took the big ones, so there's none left. And the reason they cut down the regrowth is because the Navy came in the 1800s and they said that any Australian red cedar on your property is owned by the Navy. So what does the farmer do? Well, I don't own it. The land under it is good for agriculture. I'm going to kill it or burn it or clear it before the Navy finds it. And that's what destroyed it. So attempts to try and conserve or control tree farms only encourages farmers to neglect the trees on their farm, like the she oak, like the Banksia. But if we turn it around and say, if you grow it, you own it, and you can harvest it, we'll actually get a lot more. And on our farm, we don't have tip moth. We grow these tall, straight red cedars. Some Queenslanders have never seen a red cedar quite as tall and straight as that one in the right-hand side, which is on our place. That tip moth is on a farm in New South Wales, and I've seen just the same over your way, because you don't have them. So there's many ways to grow trees, and I just want to shout out to a very good friend of mine, Andrew Stewart, who just won the Bob Hawke Landcare Award for his work. Here he is standing next to one of our spotted gums, but he grows spotted gums on his property for shelter. It's a 500-acre property. He's got 20% tree cover, and he plants them in a way. This is just some research on shelter belts. We know how shelter belts work. This is his design. So he's got 3 rows of prune spotted gum that will produce timber. Between those, he grows local indigenous understory plants, including flowers that they harvest commercially. He'll get timber, flowers, shelter, biodiversity, waterlogging control, all from this shelter belt. And he's one of these landholders like Jenny During and others who have learned, I can marry these things together. I don't have a conservation area on my farm and a plantation area on the other. I take all those ideas and I put it into one planting, because that's just common sense for farmers. Why would you separate your conservation and production areas and not get the two together? I want to talk a little bit about exotic trees. I've got another 10 minutes or so, just because so many people often think, how can you plant exotic trees? How can that be part of your conservation planting? And I want to show particularly 2 species, I've got the coast redwoods here. Coast redwoods, we just tallest tree in the world. Our trees are 33 years old. We've started harvesting. This is the first one we cut down. I know the timber's pretty good, and I also know the value's pretty good because I've started using the timber. But I want to highlight something about value that emphasizes that importance of being that little boy tapping that wheel as it rolls down the hill. I've talked a bit about thinning and pruning. We're manipulating the growth to improve the quality of the timber. Now, this shows on the bottom axis the diameter of the log and the value of that log in New Zealand, a trial that was done on Red Cedar. Oh, sorry, it was done on coast redwood that I cut down. So you can see as you get larger diameter, the value of those logs per cubic meter increases dramatically. If I work it out for my particular log, which was about 70 centimeters in diameter, you can see I'm off the curve there. And I'm at the part of the curve where the value of that log is increasing dramatically because the volume of the timber, the quality of the timber improves, and the ability to harvest that timber, extract it, improves with the diameter of that log. So I've already used some of the wood from this tree. We'll be using the rest in our new house building for doors. It's a beautiful, durable timber, quite lightweight and stable, and it's the sort of thing. But if you only grow smaller trees, whatever the species, they're not worth very much. Firewood, pulpwood, maybe $5 or $10 a tree. If you can get diameter on quality, that means prune straight trees, your value increases dramatically. But the reason I plant redwoods is for this problem. I don't know if you've got sodic soils over there. These are soils that are high in sodium. Comes from salt, and you're familiar with salt. But in some soils, our creeks run fresh water, but the salt that's in the soil has been retained as a sodium ion, and that affects the structure of the soil, making it very easy to erode like this. And you can see all our dams and our creeks actually run after rain as muddy water. And I've got this little control experiment showing that if you add gypsum or aluminium sulfate, it actually settles out. And that shows that it's a sodic soil. Like you put alum in your dam to clear it up, or in your swimming pool, you put aluminium sulfate if it's got muddy water in it. So you start thinking, okay, I know the problem. How can I change it? And this is a rainstorm event. All these eucalypts and wattles that I planted in this creek, they've done nothing to control the erosion problem. But the redwoods, just 18 trees on this little erodible soil, they've stopped the erosion, and the water is running clear over the surface rather than come out in that gully from underneath. And that's where the redwoods are really got this ability to grow into the clay, change the chemistry, help bind up by adding calcium out of the calcite, bind up some of that soil. And we start seeing there are a role for exotic trees that have an ability to do things to correct a land care problem. And you don't see many land care groups going out saying, I'm going to plant an exotic tree for conservation. But to me, it's the same as putting a nest box up. It's artificial, it's introduced, but it can actually solve the problem. And we start looking at a lot of different things. So when we talk about growing trees, we're balancing two things. On one hand, we've got cooperation. I've mentioned root grafting, the importance of growing your trees close together when they're young so they shelter each other. And we hear a lot about fungal networks, so we're not sure really how significant the contribution is. But I mentioned fungi as being an important element. These are all good. But on the other side of the equation, trees are competing for light, for moisture, for nutrients, and we need to balance these two. I would not be able to produce eucalypt logs 80 centimeters worth harvesting, or redwoods worth harvesting, which are over 80 centimeters in diameter, in less than 30 years if I hadn't managed the competition. I get all the cooperation, but if the trees were competing, they'd be like in a native forest or a pulpwood plantation. They'd all be tall and skinny and useless for timber production. So this is the balancing act. This is why we need master tree growers in the landscape who understand that different species need different levels of space to grow. And I talk about this in the book. And there's these opportunities when you plant the trees, can you marry them with grazing? I graze between our young trees for fire protection and for weed control and for aesthetics. And I use a different guard technique that's appropriate for our sheep that allows me to do good weed control and grow them on. And this allows me to get enough trees in there for shelter, but then as they develop, I can still continue grazing underneath them. And then I start pruning and thinning as they grow to create a landscape where I'm saying, okay, what do I need to do next to get the tree that I want to grow the best? And we've got lots of different species, and I'll just go through some poplars, and we've got black walnuts, which is a very slow growing species. That child on the left is now 30 years old, and the tree's not bigger than this. But black walnut produces a very high value timber that's very stable, easy to mill, and can be used for lots of different uses in some fashion. And the last one I'll mention is oaks. I think oaks can be planted for conservation because they're so good at controlling bushfire. They trap embers, they shield and slow radiation. They've got no debris underneath, and you can graze underneath them to reduce the fire risk. If we can reduce the fire risk on our farms and use introduced species even, or local species that aren't eucalypts, that don't burn so well, to actually reduce the fuel load, we can actually protect some of these landscapes in the face of climate change. We don't want more fierce fires. We know that temperatures are getting worse. Maybe we have to change the landscape in some way to reduce that in some fashion. So we use oaks around our house for fire protection. The sheep eat the acorns during autumn. I need to acknowledge that some people have experienced around the world some toxic effect, but we don't seem to have that. And I actually know that the faster I grow oaks, the larger the trees. But the larger the trees, the better the quality of the wood. So this is me thinning an oak forest. So this is going back to the start. I planted the trees close together so they shelter each other. I thinned out and just leave the best quality ones. I prune those up as they grow so they're straight. And then I give them space so they grow diameter. And I graze underneath them to control the fire hazard and to provide shelter. And I fit them into the landscape where for oaks, they're providing fire protection. For other species, they're providing conservation outcomes. And at the farm scale, you have all these different values coming together. Maybe you can start exploring some interesting products, whether it's native food, shiitake mushrooms growing on oak logs, which is what we do. You can even grow them on eucalypts in some fashion. Before I finish, I want to say a few words about some of the outstanding tree growers you've got in Southwest. And I'm going to miss some, but I really want to thank David Jenkins at Bridgetown, who planted trees the same year I did in 1987 on his farm. He's got some bigger ones than us. He's gone through horrific fires. He's harvested lots of trees. He loves these trees and he's reluctant to cut them down. But he's now got a perpetual forest. Their farm can produce timber, marketable timber, which he's now milling up with his mill and getting dried commercially. He could do this forever. Timber production can be an annual income forever on this farm because he's got trees that are always replacing the ones he grew. Another one is Jeff North, who's at the stage of, he's really explored growing Western Australian native eucalypts like the Stewart I think he's got here. And he's much younger than David and I, and he's got this advantage. He's got the experience and knowledge, and he's exploring. He's now harvesting timber on a farm scale and doing some really good work, demonstrating the possibilities of some of these non-traditional timber species. A lot of their work was driven and supported by this guy on the right, Richard Moore. Friend, worked in the department, involved in a lot of work in that region. He's helped us as early tree growers understand how to manage these trees to get the highest value out of them. And I just want to finish again with Jenny During, who I think it's one of the most beautiful properties in Australia, and I just love visiting. And thanks to Jenny and her family. So having groups of farmers like this working together, trying out new ideas is just like what we have in our Otway network. We share ideas and experience. We celebrate the fact we all like doing different things with our tree growing in some fashion. And we know that our legacy will not just be the trees that we plant on our own property, but also what we provide in terms of knowledge and enthusiasm to younger tree growers and others in our neighbourhood in some fashion. So I'll leave it there. It's leaving some time for questions and discussion. And if I can try to work out how to get back out of this, we'll go back to that. If you don't mind, I'll highlight my book there. It came out a couple of years ago. It's now in the 3rd print run, and it's just exploring, using the similar examples we discussed, how growing trees for aesthetics and conservation can also support profit, and vice versa in some fashion. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope technically wise that all came through okay.
Oh, thanks so much, Rowan. That was fantastic, and I really love the concept of multitasking. You know, things like shelter belts, not just having a shelter belt that's just a shelter belt. It's obvious, really, when you think about it. And I have just put two shelter belt rows in of my own. I think I'll be doing some strategic planning with those. Which brings me to, I'll wait, but our audience is obviously mulling over their questions. I haven't received any yet. I'm sure we're going to get some shortly. But I have a question in the meantime, that, you know, the process of deciding what trees you want to put on your farm. I mean, in your Master Tree Growers course, you do have a kind of a, not so much a framework as a model for helping people with their decisions, don't you?
Well, it's very simple. You ask them why they want to grow trees, and the first thing I do with all my courses, whether I'm in East Timor, Vanuatu, Western Australia, or North Queensland, we just go around and ask why farmers want to grow trees, and it always falls into 4 categories. Some people are only interested in one of those items. Many are interested in 2 or 3. Some say, well, this is my main one. If I can get some of the other values and as an add-on, that's fantastic. They want to plant trees to support their agricultural enterprise. And often that's shelter, maybe a little bit of waterlogging control, but basically changing the landscape and the climate so that it's less risky for farming and more productive. And most farmers will have, I can't think of a farm I've ever been to that couldn't have a few trees to improve their agricultural production, because we know the importance of shade and shelter for cows and sheep, and maybe even shelter for crops in terms of evaporation. The other one is biodiversity and conservation, and we're very familiar with that after 30 years of land care. We've all been involved in it. I'm doing a bird survey again tomorrow morning with someone who's mentoring me. I love counting how we're getting more bird species on this farm now than we have in the native forest in the national park up the road, because we've got more diversity than the national park. And that's another measure to say that we're doing something positive for the landscape, even if it's just in bird species. And the other one is products, whether it's bush food, just firewood, fence posts for your own use, maybe some timber for your own use, maybe whatever the product might be, honey. And then so many people are able to tap into different markets. And the final one is, I call it aesthetics. They just want to make the farm more attractive and a better asset to pass on to future generations. And part of that can just be by, most farmers they're going to plant trees now. It takes a long time. Okay, we all know that. Does that mean we shouldn't do it? Or does that mean we should do it now for the person who's going to take on the property next? Plant the trees because you want trees now. Manage them so that you can pass on the farm to the next generation, who have the opportunity then of having 2 income sources rather than 1. And that's a lovely gift. You've wrapped up 30 years of time in a tree, and you've passed it on to someone who's only 30 years old or 40 years old, who wouldn't be able to do it in their own working lifetime. And that's a great opportunity to do that. So we have but it reflects, can we find the best option to meet the farmer's interests? Yeah.
And you didn't mention, but I don't think you did anyway, the value you add to your land.
Yeah, well, we've had people value of course, that the value of your property really depends on who buys land in your area. Now, I know your area well, most of it. People are buying land not only for its productive potential, but also for its residential, its lifestyle, its capital potential improvement over time. It's fact that it's a long way away from Sydney is a good thing or something. So there's lots of different interests. Now, again, if you've particularly if you've got a property that's ours is only 100 acres, so it'd be very hard to make an agricultural income off it now. Despite the fact it was developed as dairy farming land 100 years ago, but in 100 years in the future, maybe it can still be commercial if you're producing high value products into an artisan market in some way.
Yeah,
I can see the questions now. Someone mentioned, I mentioned willows. I was talking about poplars. I do agree that willows are a high risk. I'm not a willow supporter. We have crack willow, which is a male clone that grows in our creeks and spreads very slowly, but we've been killing it off. I am very concerned about garden variety willows and also cricket bat willows. And we have grown cricket bat willows, but I won't do it again because they're female and they can cross with some of those male willow varieties and become a real seed risk. And weed aspects of exotics is something you have to consider, but also you have to consider the weed risk of natives. Now, I know a big weed in the Blackwood Valley is Blackwood, and a weed we have is New South Wales Cootamundra wattle. So you've got to be careful about introducing species that may become weedy. But then we've got the challenge, what do we do in the face of climate change if we don't introduce a species that can handle the heat? So I'm growing a lot of New South Wales species, Australian red cedar and silky oak, and they may naturalise in this area, but they're much better adapted to climate change. So this whole weed debate is interesting, but keep away from the obviously dangerous exotics and stick to the ones that we can possibly manage or justify given the fact that they provide some elements of conservation and biodiversity.
Yeah.
Is it ever, I'll just go through some questions. Is it ever too late to prune for sawlogs? Yeah, yes, it can be too late. It's tough if the branches are over 5 or 7 centimeters in diameter, and if the trunk is larger than about 20 centimeters, it's going to be a lot of work, and maybe you won't get that return. But I'm happy if people well, the way I do it is, yes, you can send me emails and pictures of your property. I would encourage you to read the book first, and then I would be happy to answer questions and help people address particular problems. And I get farmers to send me photos of their trees, and we go through some email exchange to help them explore their options. But it's best if we have the right language and shared knowledge before that in some way. Oh, India and Thailand on the questions. Okay, yeah. Cattle grazing below trees is pretty tricky. Our neighbours' cows often get in here, and I watch what they do. If you're grazing cattle, a lot of the risk is rubbing on the tree, so the trees have to be pretty strong. And I think in most cases you have a fence. It is maybe have a gate so you can open it up and do some crash grazing, but be very careful about leaving cattle in amongst trees until they're quite strong. Clearing regulations when thinning trees. I'm not really talking about native forest management. There are lots of rules about native forest management. There are some ridiculous rules in Victoria about planted trees that I won't get into. But in most cases, if you plant the trees, even for conservation, depending on where you got the money for the conservation project, if you plant trees with your own money, you're allowed to manage them, thinning them and doing that. And that's one of the things we do in our group. We advocate on behalf of landholders to show how active management is not a conservation concern, it's a conservation positive. People talking about sowing pasture under trees, that is pretty tricky. And I won't say my pastures are much good because my interest is more in the timber. But Andrew, my colleague, who is an ag scientist, and he's planted 20% of the farm under trees, keeps the trees in belts and doesn't graze too much under them, and then manages his pastures by sowing and improving them in some way. What height and girth and age do these get for commercial? Well, I'm exploring your Western Australian river Banksia. I'd go and have a look. Look at some of the places where people have planted them. And I'm surprised how quickly they grow. and they do need to be pruned because they're multi-branching, but that can work quite well, and you don't have to prune it very high. I like the idea of pruning it high enough so that I can just drive the tractor close to them, or at least get the ute under them. And when you come to harvest them, you've got a 2 or 3 meter log, which is very good. Okay. You hardly mentioned sugar. Eucalyptus cladocalyx is sugar gum. Um, yeah, I've only got a couple of sugar gum farm. They are extremely aggressive trees with pasture and even understory species, which is partly why they grow so well in a dry landscape. I find them particularly messy. The timber is very good firewood and it is very class 1 durable, but I love red ironbark. And if you want a class 1 durable timber, go red ironbark for us in the east, and be different for you. And I'm also growing Telwood from New South Wales, which is a class 1 durable timber, which gets its durability from a oil in the wood rather than density, and that makes it quite an interesting asset as well, because it has durability in marine environments and some other conditions, which are quite interesting. So yes, there's many species you can grow. Cladocalyx would be listed in my species at the back of the book, but it's widely grown on farms. But I think it's just something I have difficulty fitting it into my own place because it's just so competitive and nothing grows well underneath it and stuff. But a lot of people love it, particularly in dryland areas, out in the wheat belt and down at near Esperance. It grows quite well into quite large trees. Even the primary schools used to plant it over there, and they've had to cut it all down, cut all the tops off and pollard it because they drop limbs quite badly in primary schools. And you see some huge ones in primary schools out in the drylands of Western Australia, from Albany, around Albany, and further into the wheat belt. Okay.
I think that's the
biodiversity credits or carbon credit. The way I respond to this, that under the current offers, if you like, or schemes, first of all, 99.9% of farmers who plant trees for the reasons that they want trees will not be able to get paid for their biodiversity or their carbon, despite the fact they're obviously contributing a positive. This is something that I'm very concerned about, because all you hear about is the farmers who do get the money, or the big landholders or the companies who get it because they're able to achieve scale, and they're the ones that are promoted. But I don't know any farmer in the Otway area, and we've got 150 members of our network, all planting trees at different scales. I can't think of one who's been paid for the carbon or the biodiversity on their trees. Many farmers receive grants for biodiversity, and some receive grants or free trees to put them in for carbon. But in doing so, they're not allowed to touch those trees for production. And these are the ridiculous rules, because production can be a positive for biodiversity and carbon. But because of the interest groups running these agendas, they just don't allow it, because it is an anathema to say that a farmer with a chainsaw can be a conservationist. And we've got to work through our own examples. We have to show through examples that we are custodians caring for lands for generations, and we're using forestry in a way to build an asset, and we're not doing the type of forestry as we described before that people don't like. We're doing beautiful forestry, telling different stories in different ways. You got Agonist down the bottom, and I don't know about that one, but I see it in Western Australia a lot. And it certainly grows well, so I'd be interested in that. Thank you, Stephen, for your response.
Someone's asked about, are you in contact with AFPA? I don't actually know what AFPA is, Australian Forestry something or other. I don't
know. The Plantation Association. I don't know. There's probably someone from AFPA who's writing that question down. Yes, the plantation industry have a lobby group that try to advocate for commercial timber. Most of their members are large producers, and as I've got no concerns. about conventional pine plantations, even large-scale pine plantations. I just know that most farmers don't want 10 hectares of monoculture pine plantation on their farm. So we're going to get a lot of trees onto the farming landscape if that's the only model we're talking about. So I would like AFPA to actually start exploring how forestry can help other stakeholders. How can forestry be done in a way that supports conservation? How can it be done in a way that supports local councils, tourism, and stuff like that? And for them to let go of their models and say there are other ways to do that, and we're going to support through research and advocacy all types of tree growing, because it's all going to produce wood, particularly if it's well managed and done by people who are connected to the industry. So there's a great opportunity there. We've had trouble crossing that divide because most of the plantation companies rightly say you're too small. You're not going to supply housing timbers. You're not growing the species that our millers want. I acknowledge that. I am milling some radiata pine frost frame now, but despite the demand, we don't produce enough to make the local mill interested. So forestry happens at different scales. I'm just interested in how we can expand the range of activities by engaging more with the family farmers, and scale will follow success. And should we succeed in different species in different landscapes, you might find we have a new industry in 50 years' time with hundreds of farmers growing hectares and hectares and hectares of trees, supporting industry in different ways.
Yeah, and I think times are changing. Old paradigms seem to be falling away left, right and centre. So you just don't know where we're going in the future. Let's hope there's less dogma and more real listening and action on some things. But someone actually asked about your courses, and obviously it's a bit hard for Rowan to get over there at the moment, as it is for anyone. And we can't make any promises, but it's one of the things that we're perhaps looking at for next year, for trying to get some funding to get going.
The Master Tree Grower program is owned by the Australian Agroforestry Foundation, which we set up when I left the university. That group is a not-for-profit group. We seek funding, other groups seek funding, and we hope to form partnerships. So we've got 2 programs actually half completed in Victoria. Both of them had to stop halfway through because of COVID. Luckily, we didn't try to do anything in a different state because New South Wales is obviously in as much trouble as Victoria. And if I went to West Australia, I wouldn't be able to come home. So I probably wouldn't get there anyway, would I? So you wouldn't let us in. But we do work with the local groups. And in Western Australia, we've done a lot with Richard Moore and the Southwest Agroforestry Network called SWAN. That's probably a group that we continue to work with, who partner up with catchment management groups like yours, and put in sort of joint bids and have. It's a course run by landholders, and we'd like to run it in the region where the landholders are, rather than bring them out of that region. So there's great possibilities on the other side, as they say. 2022.
Yes, there is light at the end of the tunnel.
Yep.
Well, thanks, Rowan. We won't take up any more of your time. It is the evening over there, I know, so you probably haven't had your dinner yet. But thanks once again for an absolutely brilliant webinar, and great to see you had such a great audience response as well. And all the best from us over here in the West. Stay COVID free, and really hope to see you next year over here. We'll see what we can do about that. So we'll let you go now.
I've just put my website up there, which has a link button, so you can send me a message or just Google me. And there's lots of free information on the website as well, and as an opportunity to follow up and grab a book. So thanks very much to the Lower Blackwood group, and now that we've made the introductions, we'll be over there next year to work together to have a course that delivers on your interests as a conservation land management group, and also landholders' interest as family farmers, and that'd be quite exciting. So thanks very much, Kate, and everyone else there, and we'll carry on. Thank you.
And everybody, that's it for today, everybody. But if I could just ask you before you sign out to complete our evaluation form, it only takes a few minutes, and it's super helpful for us to make sure we're providing content that's important to you. So many thanks once again to you all, and look forward to seeing you at our next event.